Welcome everybody. I'd like to welcome you to another Insight APSAD webinar. My name's Jim Hunt. I'm one of the nurse educators here at Insight. Before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which this webinar is taking place today. I'd like to extend my appreciation and respect to elders past, present and emerging, and I'd like to extend that welcome and respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders that might be joining us on webinar land. So welcome and thank you. Today we've got a bit of a topical webinar for you. Generally, substance use remains fairly constant. We know that there are trends that go up and down as years go past, but generally the main drugs, the methamphetamines, the opioids, the cannabis, they kind of always stay around. However, in that we also get trends in drug use. So last year, or maybe the year before, for example, we were getting substances such as N-ethylpentylone being sold as MDMA or methamphetamine. And that was a trend that spiked for a little while and then it kind of dropped down again. And today's webinar is going to be on one of those trends. What seems to be happening at the moment is that we're getting an influx of what you might term as fake benzodiazepines. So as a bit of information for you guys, we've managed to arrange a forensic scientist, or a forensic chemist, I should say, Blakey, and a forensic toxicologist, Andrew Griffiths, who is a senior toxicologist in his place, and they've come to present on the influx of benzodiazepines currently appearing in Australia. So without any further ado, could you kindly welcome Blakey and Andrew Griffiths to present on fake benzodiazepines. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So I work in the illicit drug group, which is part of the forensic chemistry section at QHFSS. So the information that I'm going to be presenting today is about designer benzodiazepines that have been detected in seized drug exhibits. This information is a result of the work of many scientists in the illicit drug group, so I would just like to acknowledge them all at the start. To try and get an understanding of the availability and the impact of a certain class of drugs in the community, there's many different types of information that you can look at. Certainly looking at what's being detected in seized drugs is part of that picture. The information that Andrew is going to speak about, looking at detections in forensic toxicology specimens, is another really important part to give that understanding. But there are many other types of information, some of which we will touch on during the presentation. I think it's important to have an understanding of what's happening globally. While drug availability and patterns of use is going to vary from state to state within Australia and certainly from country to country, and we may not always see the drug trends that are happening overseas occur here, they can give us some kind of indication of what could be on the horizon, so it's important to be aware of them. When we're talking about designer benzos, one country where there has been a notable impact is Scotland, who have had a significant increase in their drug-related deaths and an associated increase in the detection of benzodiazepines. It is important to note we're not necessarily talking about benzos in isolation, and it can be associated with polydrug use. We have a bit of a closer look at those benzodiazepines, and this is from a presentation by Andrew Macaulay. You can see that the designer benzo atizolam has had a significant increase in the detection in drug-related deaths. Also, just last week, the UK issued a public health alert in relation to fake or illicit benzos and associated harms, so increasing deaths and hospitalizations. So it is something that's happening right now. If we shift over to the United States and the Center for Forensic Science Research and Education, which are doing really excellent work in the new psychoactive substance area at the moment, identifying new compounds in toxicology specimens, but also really getting information out quickly, which is so important. They've done a trend report from the second quarter of 2020. And again, atizolam is the most common designer benzo that they're seeing as well. So what are these compounds? Well, designer benzos, or street benzos as they're sometimes referred to, are a class of NPS, and there's something that probably hasn't had the same degree of attention as some of the other groups like the fentanyl analogs or the synthetic cannabinoids in the past. But I think that's certainly changing at the moment due to a recognized harm. We're talking about compounds related to the therapeutic benzos that are newly emerging on the drug market and may not have any legal therapeutic use or may not be covered by legislation. This is obviously going to vary a little bit from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The types of compounds that you may see are drug, excuse me, drug candidates that have been investigated by a pharmaceutical company but have never been marketed. You can see metabolites of known benzos that have been shown to have some activity in their own right, and then they become marketed as a drug, adding an extra layer of complexity for our toxicology colleagues. And you can also see compounds that are just chemical modifications of the known benzos. Now, I have included some references at the end of this presentation, but I wanted to draw particular attention to this reference for anyone wanting some more information, just background info on designer benzos and looking at the range of compounds that you can encounter. This is certainly worth reading. When it comes to those chemical modifications, they can be quite small, as simple as replacing one hydrogen atom with one fluorine atom. But small changes in the chemical structure can lead to significant changes in the pharmacology of the compound. This is probably true of all drug classes. We've certainly seen it in the NPS market before with the synthetic cannabinoids, where the 5-fluoropentyl compounds can have higher potency than their non-fluorinated compounds. Also, a drug like 4-fluoroamphetamine has a very different pharmacological profile to amphetamine. Seeing therapeutic benzodiazepines in drug seizures is certainly not unusual. The two that we would see most frequently are alprazolam and diazepam, and we generally see them as pharmaceutical products, either Australian or overseas. What you will commonly see with pharmaceutical drugs is that the name of the first marketed product tends to become synonymous with all compounds, all products that contain that drug. Certainly true with these two. Alprazolam was marketed in the late 70s, early 80s under the brand name Xanax, and you'll see the word Xanax used to refer to anything that contains alprazolam. Similarly, diazepam was marketed in the 60s as Valium, and that name is just used generically. What we did start to see with the advent of the NPS market is particularly alprazolam started to appear in different forms. So we were seeing it in powders of apparent high purity. We were seeing it in liquids. We were also seeing it on tabs or blotter papers, more commonly associated with LSD. And I guess when you consider the tablets, the therapeutic dosage of alprazolam in that 0.5 milligram to 2 milligram tablets, it's not that surprising to see it down in that lower dose type of presentation. When it comes to the designer benzos, there are 6 compounds that we've detected in Queensland seizures that we would put in this class. That's a relatively small number when you compare it to the number of synthetic cannabinoids or cathinones that we've seen. But certainly based on casework at the moment, we would consider this the most prevalent class of NPS that we're seeing in Queensland at the moment. The first designer benzo we saw back in 2011, and this was phenazepam, which was investigated in the Soviet Union in the 1970s and has been marketed therapeutically in Russia. Interestingly, when we first saw it in Queensland, they were also seeing it on plant material packaged as synthetic cannabis in New Zealand. There were also reports in 2012 from US Poison Center of air freshener spray bottles labeled as Xanny, a nickname for Xanax, which also contained phenazepam. Now, we haven't seen this compound since then, and that's not an unusual thing with NPS. You might see them once or twice and then they may not reappear. Moving to 2013, we saw the first detection of atizolam. Now, atizolam is technically not a benzodiazepine. It's classed as a thienodiazepine, so a slight modification to the structure, but still generally grouped within that designer benzo category. It was developed in Japan. It was marketed in the 80s, has been used therapeutically in Italy, Japan, India, and we will still see blister packs of tablets stated to contain 1 milligram of atizolam with manufacturers' addresses in India coming through and seize drugs. Atizolam sticks around. 2014, we saw the first detection of flubromazolam. Now, there are related patents for this compound going back to the 80s. It was reported as an NPS in 2014. And was offered for sale online as pellets or pure powder, which is not unusual presentations. It is reported to have a higher potency, and I'm not going to be talking about the relative potency of these compounds much. That's Andrew's area of expertise, other than to note as we go through this presentation that the potencies do differ, and 2 milligrams of one compound is not equivalent to 2 milligrams of another compound. 2014, we also saw the first detection of flubramazepam. Now, this was investigated as a drug candidate back in the 60s and 70s, but was never marketed, and then reported as an NPS in 2013. Atizlam sticks around, and then in 2017, we saw the first detection of diclazepam. You could also call this compound chlorodiazepam, so we're replacing one hydrogen with one chlorine. It was investigated in the 60s, but never marketed, and then reported as an NPS in 2013. Again, atizlam sticks around, but it wasn't really until 2019 when we saw a sharp increase in cases where atizlam was detected, and this was predominantly as counterfeit pharmaceutical products. It's worth noting the numbers that are represented here relate to a seizure. One seizure may contain multiple exhibits. An exhibit may contain 2, 10, hundreds, in some cases have contained thousands of tablets. We also in 2019 saw the first detection of flualprazolam, also known as fluoroalprazolam. Again, one hydrogen replaced with one fluorine. This is a compound that was investigated in the 70s, lots of research in benzos in that era it seems, but was never marketed. And it was detected in blood specimens in the US in 2018 by CFSRE, the lab that I mentioned earlier. So you can see from this that atizlam is the dominant designer benzo that we're seeing. What I'm going to do now is just go through some of the different presentations that we've encountered it in. So back to 2013, some tablets on the Sunshine Coast, just round blue tablets with no markings. And that was pretty consistent with what we were seeing through 2014 and 2015. In 2016, it appeared in capsules, and there were a few seizures with capsules of a similar appearance. We also saw it on dosed confectionery. That's just a little Pez lolly. Again, this is a presentation that you would more commonly associate with a low dose drug like LSD. And then later in 2016, while it's not the best photo, this is a counterfeit pharmaceutical of a Roche 10 milligram diazepam tablet. We haven't re-encountered this counterfeit since then. It was in 2018 when we started to see the counterfeit Xanax with atizlam coming through, in that case on the Gold Coast, but then later that year, more Xanax on Brisbane Sunshine Coast, and also the sandoz alprazolam counterfeit. We then started to see it in liquids, so liquids in dropper bottles, in some cases labeled as atizlam with dosages on them. In other cases, there were powders of apparent high purity and then numbers of small bottles of liquids containing atizlam. The Watson diazepam counterfeit was seized in early 2019. Some more dosed confectionery. This case contained a number of different coloured pieces of confectionery that just looked like a sugar-coated tube, and the scientists that did the analysis noted that it did appear to be dosed on the outside of the lolly. Mylan A4 counterfeits in early 2019, and then we started to see the Mylan A4 coming through in bottles that resembled legitimate pharmaceutical products. Now, this presentation isn't that distinctive, just a white unmarked tablet. The reason that I've included it is looking at the atizlam data late last year. The cases that we had analysed had all been in Sunshine Coast, Brisbane and Gold Coast. And looking at the data for this presentation, it certainly seems to have spread out from there. So up to far north Queensland, Darling Downs. So we have seen it spread out from that original concentrated area. In September of last year, there were seizures of counterfeit Kalma 2 tablets. Now, this is an Australian pharmaceutical product. This is the first counterfeit of an Australian pharmaceutical that we've come across. I should note that the TGA, in conjunction with Queensland Health and New South Wales Health, have issued an alert in relation to the counterfeit Kalma products and other counterfeit benzos. They have emphasised in that alert that there is no information to indicate that any of these counterfeits have entered the supply chain. It's important to note that they are illicit tablets made to look like a pharmaceutical. New South Wales Health have also issued 2 alerts regarding counterfeit benzo tablets, and you can access them through the New South Wales Health website. We then started to see the Kalma products in bottles, and then a case from this year where we've seen Kalma tablets that even have the little protective seal over the top. Now, As I've said, most of the designer benzos that we're seeing are in counterfeit pharmaceuticals. I'm just going to go over now some of the recent counterfeits that we've seen and what drugs we've detected in them. Very recently, in conjunction with forensic toxicology, and in particular a toxicologist, Amanda Thompson, we've been having a look at dosages just to get some kind of idea of what dosage levels are there and what the variability is. So we'll start with Xanax. Now, this is a photo of the seized tablets. It's consistent with the Pfizer product Xanax, which is an overseas product. It's not registered in Australia. You cannot get this product at a pharmacy, a legitimate one, and it's stated to contain 2 milligrams of alprazolam. We have seen in some cases this tablet come through in Xanax XR bottles. It's worth noting that that is a Xanax extended release tablet. It's a different physical appearance, so it's not consistent with the Xanax XR product. In terms of drugs that we've identified, we have seen tablets that contain alprazolam. We've also seen tablets that contain flualprazolam or a mixture of both of those compounds. There have been Xanax tablets that contain atizolam. We have seen a seizure of tablets where some of the tablets contained atizolam and doxepin, an antidepressant. Other tablets in that case contained doxepin and 5-methoxydibutyltryptamine. That is an unusual finding in a counterfeit benzo. We haven't seen 5-methoxy-DBT in any other cases in Queensland. We have seen other examples of 5-methoxytryptamines, but more typically you would see them in an ecstasy type presentation, so tablets or capsules. They are reported to be psychedelics or hallucinogens. What's also interesting to note is the EMCDDA recently shared an alert from Slovenia about counterfeit Xanax tablets that contained 5-methoxy-DBT and a different benzodiazepine that we haven't seen yet. There's also a report on drugsdata.org in the US of counterfeit Xanax tablets that contain 5-methoxy-DBT. So it's unusual, but it doesn't appear to be an isolated event. We've also seen tablets that have just had paracetamol or haven't had any drugs detected. Now, as far as dosage, the alprazolam tablets that we've seen have been just over the stated dose, so about 2.8 to 3.4 milligrams of alprazolam. The flualprazolam tablets have been about 1.7 to 2, and I'll just emphasize again, 2 milligrams of flualprazolam is not equivalent to 2 milligrams of alprazolam. And then we've seen tablets that have had just under a milligram of both. We don't have any atizolam data for the Xanax tablets because we haven't, within the period we've been looking at dosage, we haven't encountered atizolam in Xanax. Move on to the mylan A4 product. Again, overseas product, not registered in Australia. It does appear to be visually consistent with what the product's meant to look like. It's stated to contain 2 milligrams of alprazolam. Now you can see that photo of the seized bottles. They do closely resemble what you would think is a legitimate pharmaceutical product. You can also see this information in the TGA alert, but just the photo on the left is a peeled back label from a bottle compared with the genuine label. These labels have an NDC or National Drug Code at the top of the label. This is a unique code used in the United States for a specific product. The counterfeit bottle's got the number right on the barcode, but for some reason the number up the top has been changed, and you can see a number of other differences if you're able to directly compare the two. As far as drugs identified, the mylan A4, some tablets have just contained atizolam. We have seen tablets that contain either alprazolam or atizolam or a mixture of both of those compounds, all in combination with low cyproheptadine, amantadine, and promethazine. So cyproheptadine and promethazine are antihistamines. Amantadine has been used in the past as an antiviral. It can be used to treat the symptoms of Parkinson's. It's not clear why this combination of 3 compounds has been seen in counterfeit benzos, though there are some theories online. It is interesting to note that that same combination has been seen in North America. It has been seen in Europe, so certainly very widespread. Now, we've also seen mylan A4 tablets that contained atizolam, alprazolam, cyproheptadine, and Ergocure 907, which we would generally refer to as MMTMP. So Ergocure 907 has been in the Queensland drug market for a little while. It was first seen in 2016. It's an industrial chemical. It's used as a photoinitiator or curing agent, hence the brand names. It does have structural similarities to the cathinone class of compound, and you can see it referred to as a highly modified cathinone. It's been seen in the drug market overseas, certainly not isolated to Australia. It has been reported in South Australia in a fatality where a fentanyl analog and MMTMP were found. So it seems to be around in a few places, an unusual finding in a counterfeit benzo. I'm not aware of any detections of that compound in counterfeit benzos outside of Australia. With dosage, the mylan, I think, has been probably one of the more variable ones that we've seen. We've had some tablets that have had about 2.5 milligrams of atizolam plus about 1.4 milligrams of alprazolam. Then there's been some that have been higher. You're up to almost 1.8 milligrams of alprazolam, and then ranging between 4 to almost 6 milligrams of atizolam on top. The ones that have just had atizolam have been almost 7 to over 8 milligrams of atizolam. What has been of recent concern in a case that we've seen is the presence of atizolam with flubromazolam. And again, we haven't seen flubromazolam in seized materials since 2014. We were actually alerted to this potential combination from the toxicology lab before we saw it in seized materials. And those tablets contain just over 4 milligrams of atizolam and 0.2 milligrams of flubromazolam. Doesn't sound like much. Again, I refer to Andrew, who'll discuss the potency of these compounds. And flubromazolam certainly seems to be a compound that is being seen increasingly in counterfeit benzos overseas. Also worth noting, these tablets are generally larger. So the Xanax are about, say, 280 milligrams in a tablet. The mylan A4 are about 500 milligrams per tablet. So if you're using the same tableting material to make a mylan tablet, you're going to end up with a higher dosage just by the fact that it's a larger tablet. The Watson diazepam tablets, so blue tablets marked DAN 5620, not quite closely resembling the legitimate product. There are some differences there. We have seen them come through in bottles labeled diazepam. They don't appear to be of the highest quality. They look like they've been printed on an inkjet printer. These tablets were also specifically mentioned in the UK alert that was released last week. We've only seen a few seizures. They've all contained atizolam, and it's all been just under 1 milligram of atizolam. Okay, to the kalma product. So this is a photo of the seized tablets. I've said that they're visually consistent with kalma, which is stated to contain 2 mg of alprazolam. When I say that, if you had a genuine tablet side by side, maybe there would be some differences. Maybe the color's slightly off, maybe the height of the tablet is slightly different, but without having that direct comparison, they're very difficult to tell from a genuine tablet. I mentioned we've seen them in seized bottles. The bottle on the right that has a little protective foil seal that you would expect to see with pharmaceuticals, the scientist analysing the case noted that in the little label down the side of the bottle, there is a typo that they've misspelt the company name. That's not present in the bottle on the left, which was also counterfeit tablets. We've subsequently seen another bottle where they managed to spell the name right, but the little alpha logo was missing. So there's obviously a few batches of these bottles going around. In terms of drugs identified, we have seen some tablets with alprazolam, some with atizolam, some with no drugs detected. There is an analytical marker present in the genuine kalma tablets that allows us to differentiate between the genuine and the counterfeit, even though they're containing the same active ingredient. I think probably even more concerning is, in some cases, tablets from the same bottle. Some will contain alprazolam, some will contain atizolam, some will have no drugs detected. So we're not talking about separate seizures and separate batches. This is within a single bottle, you will get that variation. Dosage assessment, atizolam has gone from about 1.6 up to 4.4 milligrams. And the alprazolam tablets we've seen have been about 1.4 to 2 milligrams. Just finishing off the sandoz alprazolam marked GG249. Again, it's not a registered product in Australia. It does generally look consistent with the sandoz product. We've only identified atizolam in these tablets. Again, these are a larger tablet, which is worth noting. There's many tips online for how to spot a fake. They seem to contradict each other. I haven't worked it out myself yet. As far as dosage, 2.3 to 2.6 milligrams of tisalam. Sometimes the percentage of tisalam is similar to other lower dose tablets we've seen, but it's a larger tablet, you get that increased dose. We have seen only one seizure to date that has contained the Dava-Par alprazolam. So these are a green bar tablet marked S93. The drugs identified were clonazepam, which is available therapeutically in Australia, and lidocaine. We don't have dosage because it was only the single tablet. You do see these tablets referred to a lot online as green hulks. Lastly, just looking at something that you do see generally in black market drugs or NPS market is mislabeling. So we've had a couple of different seizures, one that contained a white powder labeled Val, which I'm assuming is meant to mean Valium, which actually contained diclozapam instead of diazepam, and also tabs in a bag labeled Valium, which contained diclozapam. We've also seen flualprazolam labeled as alprazolam, so there is that potential for mislabeling or mis-selling. So just in summary, we have seen an increasing prevalence of designer benzos in Queensland, in particular as counterfeit pharmaceuticals. These counterfeits can come in packaging that resembles a legitimate product, even to the extent of having seals there. It's worth noting that in Europe, you can see there's many reports of tablets in blister packs. We haven't encountered that yet, but it does happen overseas. You can see a variation between the drug that's identified and the dosage, even within a single container. Some of these counterfeits have dosages that are significantly higher than the expected dose. And they also contain drugs other than benzodiazepines. It's worth noting that atisalam and flualprazolam are going to come under international control later this year. Diclozapam, flubromazepam, and clonazepam that I haven't mentioned in this talk are also being considered for international control. So the impact that this has on the designer benzo market is certainly worth monitoring, whether this sees a push to new compounds. And the last thing, it is important to note that this data really talks about seizures over a certain period of time in Queensland. It doesn't necessarily encompass the full spectrum of drugs or dosages that you may see. These things are likely to vary over time and in different areas. And some references. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Andrew.
Thanks, Karen. The problem when Karen's great illicit drug lab identifies these designer benzodiazepines in seizures is that not all seizures are seized by police. And that means these drugs are actually getting out into the community, and given the high dosage or the range of dosages that Karen's identified in these tablets, the different drugs that are identified and the combinations of drugs, then we have enhanced sort of chance of adverse events occurring in the community. Things like overdoses, intoxications, and impairment of drivers is the sort of things that we'd find. And that's where forensic toxicology comes in. And I'll also acknowledge my colleagues who have done a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today as well. We service the entire state of Queensland for toxicology analysis or forensic toxicology analysis, including the coroner, where we do toxicology analysis on biological specimens relating to deceased persons. I'm going to talk a little bit about those cases today. We also do a lot of work for the Queensland Police. Obviously, we are a forensic laboratory, including alcohol and drugs in the blood of driver specimens. And these are drivers who are perceived to be impaired at the roadside or have been involved in an accident of some sort and have required medical attention. I'm just going to take a little bit of a step back though and ask this question, why benzodiazepines? So we know that they're therapeutically available in Australia, but why have they got an abuse potential? Why is there a necessary market, illicit market for them? So we know their uses. They're therapeutically used in Australia for anxiety, insomnia, and as muscle relaxants. There's a variety of other minor uses for benzodiazepines as well, but they're the major ones. And then we have effects or side effects depending on what therapeutic effect you're actually after. Things like sedation, impaired motor coordination, dizziness, speech disturbances, vision disturbances, disinhibition, euphoria. I've missed out memory disturbances there as well, mood swings. There's also the opposite to what you'd expect out of a sedative in some forms. So the paradoxical effects, erratic or hostile behaviour by certain users, often encountered due to dosage or lack of tolerance to a particular drug. So why are they abused? Well, if you cross out benzodiazepines at the top of that slide and actually write in alcohol, then the actual effects of benzodiazepines pretty much mirror what you find with the most abused drug in Australia, which is alcohol. The interesting thing about benzodiazepines, however, is that they're often co-administered with other drugs. And when we see adverse health events, they're generally due to polydrug administration. So the other question out of Karen's talk is actually why mimic alprazolam? Out of all the therapeutically available benzodiazepines on the market, why is alprazolam special? So the first one there is probably the major one, and it's actually been upscheduled to Schedule 8 recently, in the last few years at least. And that was due to its abuse potential and its sort of over-representation in overdose. It's got a short half-life, a rapid onset of effects. It's highly potent. It's actually probably the most potent therapeutically available benzodiazepine on Australian market. And uniquely, it's actually got some effects on dopamine receptors. And these are the same receptors that stimulants actually affect in the brain. And this is responsible for things like behavior, decision-making, motivation, and reward. So in the end, it actually makes users prefer alprazolam over other benzodiazepines. So this is why they're sought after, and that's why there's an illicit market for them. Because of that short half-life and the high potency, they've also got harsher withdrawal effects. So rebound anxiety is a well-known withdrawal effect from alprazolam. So if you add all of those things together, then alprazolam has actually got a high abuse liability. So that's why we're talking about alprazolam today, or things that mimic alprazolam. So let's go on to toxicology cases in Queensland. So these are actual detections in actual cases of actual individuals where we've identified these designer benzodiazepines. You can see, just like Karen was talking about earlier, etizolam has been identified the most. The fluorinated benzodiazepines are worryingly becoming more prevalent in recent times, fluarprazolam and flubromazolam, which are more potent. In the red is etizolam, so this is detections over time. And you can see detections in 2019, etizolam went up quite markedly. It looks like we're going to get around about the same level of detections here in 2020 this year. The most worrying thing about the graph, however, is the yellow and blue aspects of it, where fluarprazolam and flubromazolam, more potent benzodiazepines, are actually becoming more prevalent in these preparations. Flubromazolam in toxicology has always been identified with etizolam presence as well, and that's probably due to it being taken in the same formulation. I've become a little bit obsessed about where we're finding toxicology cases, where they're coming from, and I actually annoy my colleagues about that all the time. But we have had, in the past, found illicit drugs are actually isolated to certain areas in Queensland. So we found a synthetic cathinone called MDPV that was essentially only found in the Mount Isa region in Queensland a few years back. The problem with these designer benzodiazepines, however, is that they're actually being found across the state. So in every region of the state, in every major city along the eastern coast, more prevalent in the Brisbane region, but that's also the more populated region of Queensland as well. Even regional areas and regional districts have actually had some presence of a toxicology case being identified in that area. So Karen mentioned potency of these newer benzodiazepines earlier, and we sort of made out that etizolam was a therapeutically available drug in Japan, so therefore it's got a therapeutic dose that it can be used for. And this therapeutic dose is actually around about the same as what alprazolam is. So it isn't really a low potency drug, it's actually quite a high potency drug. So this paper, which Karen mentioned earlier from Zawilska et al., because I can't pronounce the second name, it shows the users, what the users are actually using on the street to produce the effects of light, common or strong effect of this drug. So how much they're using on the street. You can see etizolam's around about the same potency as alprazolam, probably a little bit higher. Some of the other ones we've been identifying, diclazepam through alprazolam, 2 to 3 times the potency of etizolam and alprazolam. And Karen mentioned flubromazolam. It's probably 5 to 10 times more potent than etizolam and alprazolam. And just remember, and I'm going to go over this again and again, all these drugs are usually taken with other drugs. So we know that benzodiazepines actually enhance the adverse effects associated with other drugs. So when we do find a designer benzodiazepine, these are the other classes of compounds that we've identified. The usual suspects are here. Other benzodiazepines identified in almost 50% of cases, cannabis or THC around about 50%, amphetamines and cocaine stimulants, opiates and alcohol. And there's some information to suggest that that low-level alcohol is being used in, say, drivers to keep under the limit, but supplementing with one of these benzodiazepines to increase the effect. The bottom line there, you can see that no other drugs were detected in only 7% of cases. So we're talking about a common polydrug use here when we're talking about these benzodiazepines. If we break it down a little bit further, you can see MDMA and cocaine at around about 15% of the cases that we're identifying. They're considered recreational drugs, and they're not, that's a lot higher percentage than what we'd find in the normal driving population. So it tends to be to suggest that these drugs are being used in a recreational or party sense at times as well. The most worrying aspect is the use with other central nervous system depressants, other benzodiazepines, some of which are due to being used in the same tablets, opiates and alcohol. And we know that benzodiazepines actually have additive effects when they're taken in combination with things like opiates. So the respiratory depression that opiates cause can lead to adverse health events due to that additive effect with benzodiazepines. So this is a breakdown of the other benzodiazepines that we identified. Alprazolam is the highest, and we now know that that's probably due to them being taken in the same tablet with the designer benzodiazepines. Diazepam and its metabolite nordiazepam are actually the most commonly available therapeutic drug or benzodiazepine in Australia. So that probably explains the high rate that's been identified there. We'd see that in normal driving populations as well. So I'm just going to go through some case studies, and unfortunately due to the public nature of this webinar, we are talking about forensic cases here, so I can't give many circumstances in relation to the cases, but I think it will give an idea of the other drugs that we're identifying in these cases. So etizolam, in this case, this is an impaired driver or one that's been involved in a motor vehicle accident. Etizolam found with alprazolam. There's probably the other drugs that are the interest here. So the alprazolam and the etizolam probably taken in the same formulation or possibly taken in the same formulation. MDMA is ecstasy and its metabolite were identified, quite a high concentration. Benzolectinine, which is a metabolite of cocaine. THC, the ubiquitous cannabis, is also identified. So we're talking about this recreational use of illicit drugs. We've also got a low-level type of low-level opiate in tramadol and pregabalin, which has also been identified as a drug that's commonly used with multiple other either prescribed or illicit drugs in the community. Another case, and I've taken these pretty much at random, etizolam in this case found with flubromazolam. You can see the lower concentration for flubromazolam in comparison to etizolam, but we do know it's 5 to 10 times more potent. So we're talking about an additive effect with those two taken together. The other drugs identified are carisoprodol with its metabolite meprobamate. That's actually an anti-anxiety medication that's used in America, but it's not therapeutically available here in Australia. So therefore we're talking about probably an illicitly sourced another drug that's identified in this particular case. We also see it in coronial cases, and I'll just point out the age of this person, this deceased individual, 20. There's clear information that these designer benzodiazepines are actually being used more frequently with the younger age group in late teens to early 20s. In this case, we did rapid toxicology testing, so 24-hour turnaround. Alprazolam and etizolam identified together, but there's also other drugs that have been identified here, prescribed drugs or therapeutically available drugs. 2 other benzodiazepines, diazepam and 7-aminoclonazepam, which is the metabolite of clonazepam. So in all, this individual's got 4 different benzodiazepines consumed at the one time. 2 opiates, codeine at quite a high concentration for codeine, and tramadol is also identified with its metabolite. There's an antidepressant in venlafaxine. Cannabis, again, ubiquitous in most of our cases or many of our cases. That's the type of drug combinations that we see in coronial cases. Again, age 19. This one's got even more interesting toxicology if you're a toxicology nerd, like I am. Amphetamine is actually a metabolite of the drug we know as methylamphetamine, the drug we know as speed or ice. And usually you'd find, if it was due to have been metabolism, you'd find a lower concentration. But in this case, we've actually found a higher concentration of amphetamine. Now, amphetamine is available as dextroamphetamine, which is available therapeutically for ADHD or narcolepsy in Australia. So this individual's probably taken both an illicit drug, speed or ice, plus a therapeutic drug, amphetamine. Again, we're seeing other benzodiazepines, clonazepam, and a very high level of its metabolite or breakdown product there identified, 7-aminoclonazepam, an antidepressant, sertraline, an antipsychotic, olanzapine, an anabolic steroid, boldenone. And then we've got 2 designer benzodiazepines, diclazepam and its relative metabolites. It actually metabolizes into a therapeutically available drug in Australia called lorazepam, along with other ones that aren't available. And etizolam at extremely high concentration for that particular drug in this particular case. So I've talked about the different drugs that we're seeing in toxicology cases. You can see the detections that we're seeing over time, and they seem to be rising in recent times. This is etizolam. Karen alluded to earlier what was happening in Scotland. So this is over a 10-year period, benzodiazepine-related deaths that occurred in Scotland. Etizolam is in red. And therapeutically available benzodiazepines are actually in the grey, the light grey there. So in actual fact, in 2018, the illicitly available designer benzodiazepines actually outstripped the use of therapeutically available benzodiazepines in Scotland. Hopefully we won't see that trend in Australia. Flubromazolam, we mentioned that was probably one of the most potent, well, it is the most potent designer benzodiazepine that we've identified due to that fluorination and the higher binding to the receptors that it shows. This is a case study from America showing etizolam and flubromazolam in drivers. And you'll see all of my literature that I'm quoting from overseas is either late 2019 or this year, 2020. So this is a current problem that's happening across the world. You'll notice the ages. This is 10 drivers who are impaired, or judged to be impaired in America. The ages are low, basically. In the Queensland drivers that we've seen, the average age of the drivers has been 23. If we took the drivers as a whole, the average age would be in the 30s. So we are talking a young dynamic when it comes to these designer benzodiazepines. The other things to note is our concentrations that we're identifying here in Queensland mirror or bookend the concentrations that have been identified overseas in impaired drivers. You'll notice, however, in this American study that flubromazolam and atizolam are never identified together. Here in Queensland, we've always identified them together. So we get those additive effects. In the column on the right, you see that other drugs are virtually always identified, and they're similar to the ones that we've identified here in Queensland: stimulants, opiates, other benzodiazepines, cocaine, etc. And all except one basically identifies other drugs of interest that actually, it's hard to interpret these cases, the impact of a particular benzodiazepine when they're always involved in with other drugs. Except for case 5 here, where only a small amount of alcohol was actually identified in this case, around about 0.014%. And it was a 17-year-old female, and the authors of this paper actually went on to talk about the driver impairment that this person showed at the roadside. So weaving across lanes, straddling line lanes, altering speed for no apparent reason. When they interviewed her, there was a faint smell of alcohol, which explains the low level alcohol that was identified. Slurred speech, responded to questions very, very slowly to the officer, and they were judged to be impaired under a sobriety test. So essentially, because flubromazolam in this case was actually found without the presence of other drugs, the impairment in this case due to the potency of that drug is actually due to flubromazolam alone, or with the additive effects with the low level alcohol. Fluoroprazolam, the one that we're seeing most of at the moment, you can see often found with alprazolam, again, probably taken in the same preparation. The usual suspects are identified in combination in this case. So methamphetamine, you can see the concentrations are actually the right amount. So this shows that they've probably taken the illicit drug rather than amphetamine on its own. Cannabis at a fairly high concentration for THC there. And a low dose opiate called buprenorphine, and a beta blocker, atenolol, identified in that particular case. Unusually for fluoroprazolam, we've actually identified 5 cases where no other drugs were identified. So the impairment or potential impairment that caused the motor vehicle accident in this case was due to just these drugs alone, including the first case we ever identified for fluoroprazolam, which we didn't quantitate because we never thought we'd see the drug again at that point. So these cases all represent possible showing that these fluorinated benzodiazepines are more potent and therefore have potential to actually impair someone by themselves without the co-administration of other drugs. They've also been identified in deaths overseas, both in Sweden, in Finland, and in other countries as well. And you can see the concentrations that they've identified here. I've only showed the Swedish cases here. The concentrations mirror the concentrations that we've seen for fluoroprazolam in our driver population. And we've seen fluoroprazolam mostly in our drivers rather than our coronial cases at this stage. On the right, you can see that most of these cases that are involving fluoroprazolam in death have also involved multiple other drugs, antidepressants, opiates, stimulants, all types of drugs on the left there, on the right there, sorry. Except for 2 cases that actually involved just fluoroprazolam at levels we've identified in living people, in drivers here in Queensland. The poisoning in this case has been judged to be solely due to fluoroprazolam alone, which shows that there's also a toxicity associated with these drugs on their own. I've mentioned age quite a few times. This is the first time fluoroprazolam was mentioned, another American paper, as in terms of its impairment or intoxication events. These are adolescents identified at presenting as hospitals in 2019. You can see the young ages. So we're talking about 14 to 16 years of age. Mirrors what we've been seeing in Queensland as well in driver specimens. So forensic toxicology only gives a part of the picture. The other picture might be able to filled up by people presenting at emergency departments at hospitals in relation to intoxications due to these designer benzodiazepines, or other NPS substances. So the Queensland Early Warning Drug Surveillance Project is something that we're trying to get up off the ground in recent times, collaboration with the Queensland Poisons Information Centre at the PA Hospital and the Clinical Forensic Medicine Unit. Hopefully the clinicians are going to identify patients that presented to emergency that show severe or unusual symptoms, a blood specimen sent to toxicology for analysis and quantitation. Hopefully, eventually, it will lead to the detection of new drugs before they make an impact on the community, like we've seen in our toxicology cases. We hope to give warnings out to clinicians and the public in relation to any new findings that we have identified. The project is hopefully going to start just this year. So most of my conclusions I've mentioned on the way through. More potent benzodiazepines are on the rise in Queensland, and they're worrying in their use. Polydrug use is common with benzodiazepines and remains to be common. It's worrying in the amount of young adults that seem to be using these drugs. And these drugs have been identified in all parts of Queensland. So I might just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew and Karen, for I think what's going to be a very useful presentation for the clinicians out there. As usual, we've got a number of questions that came through, so thank you very much for that, and please keep them coming while we're talking. I should have added at the beginning, and I apologise to Mark for not doing that, we also have the Director of Addiction and Psychiatry at the Royal Brisbane Women's Hospital, Mark Dalgleish, or Dr. Mark Dalgleish, who's online with us at the moment to answer any more clinical questions that the scientists may not know about. So please keep your questions in, and Mark, if you want to respond at any point, just unmute your microphone and by all means chip in. So we'll start heading through the questions. A nice simple one to start with. Could you start by letting us know what NPS stands for?
Oh, sorry. I thought I'd define that at the start. So NPS, talking about a new psychoactive substance. So generally you're talking about new compounds that are coming onto the market.
Perfect. Thank you, Karen. Somebody's asked, do we think that these novel or new substances are manufactured in Australia, or are they being predominantly imported, do you think?
Thank you, Andrew, for deferring that to me. I wouldn't exclude the possibility that it could happen here. I would imagine that it's more likely that the compounds are coming from overseas. And given that we're seeing that similar combinations of cyproheptadine, etc., that potentially the tablets are coming from overseas as well. But with the NPS market, never say never.
You just never know, yeah. Certainly. I've got a multiple part question, so thank you to the person that put this in. And you may not know this, so I may ask you to chip in, Mark. Do you know how comprehensive screening for benzos is, how often it takes place in both your setting, and I guess they're also asking in health settings?
Toxicology screening in the forensic setting, it's probably very comprehensive. The problem I guess in health setting, it would be less comprehensive, but it's not due to the laboratories themselves. It's more due to the timeframes and the resources that they've got to use them. Often the regional hospitals or something like that haven't got the same equipment that we've got in forensic science, and we use, I forgot to mention, we do use a lot of high-tech equipment, instruments that actually analyse for these compounds. It also costs money to confirm these compounds. You actually have to buy what we call reference standards to make sure that we're actually looking at the right compound and comparing it to what we find in our cases. Yep. So in terms of hospitals, yes, probably not as comprehensive, but if you talk about the normal benzodiazepine urine screens that would occur, a lot of these benzodiazepines actually do come up as positive on those screens.
That kind of led to the next question, which was, is the metabolic pathway very similar? Are the metabolites similar? So if somebody was, for example, to do a urine screen and somebody had taken diazepam or temazepam or one of the more typical ones, would it show positive even if it was atizolane, for example, that was used instead of that?
Yeah, look, in terms of immunoassays, there's been papers that have been written that show that they have the designer benzodiazepines would actually be picked up under immunoassay type screening that's generally carried out for like drugs of abuse screening in hospitals. You wouldn't be able to confirm, you'd have to confirm the presence of the benzodiazepine with like a mass spectrometry instrumentation to identify the designer benzodiazepine itself.
Yeah. The third part of that question was, if you come across a new substance like the fluoros, for example, do you then go back looking at previous forensic cases to see if they're attributed to any of those?
Do we mention, I mentioned that toxicology alerted us of the combination of atizlam and flubromazolam. And while it always becomes difficult in seized drugs when you're looking at low dose compounds, sometimes you'll only see them if you look for them, and you don't know to look for them until you're aware that they're present. In that case where the flubromazolam was very low in the seized drug, we did go back over previous tablets, specifically looking for the flubromazolam, and didn't find them. But yeah, particularly in what we're doing, sometimes you need to know what's out there to look for it, particularly when you're getting down to those more potent compounds.
Certainly. And I guess that leads me to a question: when you're doing your testing, for people that aren't aware of that, if you're putting it through a mass spectrometer or whatever it is that you're testing with, do you have to know what you're looking for to find it? Or does the thing tell you that there's something there and then you then go looking to see what that something is?
We've got general screening processes that you don't need to know what you're looking for. It's really when you get down to the low dose drugs that you need to target and specifically look for compounds.
Sure.
So we also are fortunate that we have a flag in counterfeit tablets. It gives you an indicator that there may be some type of benzodiazepine present, so we can use some specific testing to try and look for low dose compounds, but there's always a risk that you could miss it.
In terms of toxicology, it's even more of a risk that we miss these compounds. So we work hard with collaborating with Karen's group, which is just around the hallway from our group, and read international papers to show what is actually might be out there in the community. Because when you're talking about blood specimens and low dose drugs, we're talking about very low concentrations. So we need to add new drugs into our library for actually to identify those particular compounds.
I guess that's worth, like we work a lot with toxicology. We try as much as we can to take a proactive approach. So we talked about being aware of what's happening globally. If we know that there is a designer benzo that's appearing overseas, if we can try and include that in our screening, we will try and do that. But
I guess that kind of leads on to another question, which is, we talk about designer benzos and we talk about MPS, the novel psychoactive substances. When it comes to looking at overall drug-related deaths, for example, in Australia, do these deaths go down as benzodiazepine attributed, or do they go down as MPS attributed?
Andrew.
That's a fairly tough question, actually.
I like to ask those.
Really, that's right. But I guess I've got to almost explain the coronial process to answer that one. We do analysis for the coroner who's investigating these deaths, but we do it via the pathologist who's actually involved with the autopsies and etc. So that interpretation of what we find is actually maybe in conjunction with us, but it's actually also taken by the pathologist and by the coroner as a whole to determine. So the actual cause of death, whether it's actually determined to be due to benzodiazepines or to atizlam, you'd probably say that that particular drug would be mentioned in the cause of death.
Thank you. Somebody's asked, is there any harm minimisation resource with a list of these counterfeit substances that appear in Australia so that clinicians would be able to access so they know what is out there?
Probably not. Jim, we might defer that to you for harm minimisation.
I was going to say, we at Insight have lots of harm minimisation resources around benzodiazepines, which are able to obviously put forward for people. I would actually suggest that the PDF of the presentation that they've got now has actually got a list of what's currently out there at the moment.
Certainly, and the New South Wales health alerts have listed compounds that have been identified, so that would be another resource as well.
As they are not in Australia, is there a source of finding out the half-lives and metabolic pathways of these drugs, or is it just Google?
Yeah, look, Google is a great resource for many things. Some of like you probably even noticed during my presentation, the potencies of these drugs, the ones that haven't been used therapeutically, are really unknown. The half-lives, they may be have been estimated due to actual cases where you can get maybe an ante-mortem over certain periods of times, but there's a lot of lack of information. That's not just for these benzodiazepines, for most novel psychoactive substances that we encounter. They're not being used therapeutically, so they're not going through the same sort of processes through drug checking, etc. That would be required.
You mentioned in your presentation that the fluorine component kind of makes the drug more potent, or certainly appears to be that way, and we see that in other substances such as opioids, which is fluorophenols and that sort of thing. Does that follow on? Does it do the same sort of process in there and make them more potent? Yeah,
the theory is that it actually makes it bind more tightly to its receptors, and therefore you get a higher effect. So that's the theory of that. It seems to be across, as you say, fentanyls, amphetamines, synthetic cannabinoids, synthetic cathinones, benzodiazepines. It seems to be all of those cases. If you fluorinate something, it actually binds more tightly to the receptor.
So that then leads to the question that if it is potentially more potent, why do you think atizolame is more common than the fluorobenzos, for example? Now, I have my ideas about that. The fact that it is a actual medication in a couple of countries around the world, which makes it more available than something that perhaps isn't a medication elsewhere, but you may want to come in with something else.
Look,
you go.
I really have no idea why atizolame has been chosen. The cases that we saw in Scotland, there was certainly it popped up, and then there was a distribution of it throughout Scotland, and it was like the epicenter that exploded somehow. Got any ideas, Karen?
Again, just theories, but if you're looking to mimic alprazolam and you're saying that that is comparable, I'm not sure whether there is always that desire to go to the higher potencies. It becomes more difficult to look at dosage units. So it's when atizolame comes under control, whether that restricts access and what happens from there. That will be interesting to watch.
So definitely. A lot of the cases that you mentioned, you talked about ages. Was there any, particularly somebody's asked with young adults, was there any demographics between male and female as to more likely?
Male it's always more likely males identified in toxicology cases, and that's not benzodiazepine specific, that's across the board. It might be that drug use is more prevalent in driver populations. So we are talking about a small section of the population. We're not talking about the community as a whole here. But yes, certainly, I haven't done a breakdown to tell you the truth, but there's certainly males are generally more prevalent than females.
Thank you. In the Toowoomba region, someone's written in and said that a lot of 18 and 19-year-olds are presenting with Xanax or bar use. Bar tends to be a slang name used for Xanax because of the show problem, I believe. Have you got any tips or advice? And this might be something more for you, Mark, if you're listening. Any tips or advice to help engage with them? Feel free to chip in, Mark, if you can hear me.
Yes. Sorry, I was just answering another question in a private message. Look, engage. I mean, it's always really difficult because we don't have the same. We don't have the hook that we're familiar with of giving people, opiate replacement therapy. Replacement therapy for benzodiazepines is a much more thorny problem to try and tackle. It's a lot easier for the opioids. So, I mean, you're back to the basics that work for everybody, you know, to a greater or lesser extent, with psychosocial interventions, as trying to get people engaged. If that was the question, I missed the very start of your question.
Yeah, it was really about how do we engage the youth to actually open up and talk about this, and to, you know, start supporting them to manage that situation. So I think you're right. Somebody's actually built on that question. So while you're there, Mark, when a young person asks for support to get off Xanax but has a history of seizures, what would be a recommended pathway to support withdrawals, especially when the only 24/7 service, i.e. the service that you run has, is for adults 18 years plus?
Yeah, I mean, I think the risk of withdrawal seizures is most prominent when you're trying to get people, you know, withdrawn off in a hurry. That, you know, that's when we start to worry about, you know, getting the acute withdrawals. So people trying to stop, people trying to detox, you know, to use the old parlance. That's the biggest concern. And it's with benzos, it's really not the ideal treatment. Ideally, you'd want to wean somebody off slowly, and, you know, there's some excellent advice on ways to do that on, you know, Heather Ashton's site from the UK, you know, website from the UK. The problem is then how you implement that in practice in the community, and that's where it gets really tricky. Yeah, I mean, Clarence Street offers some residential support for young people trying to come off substances, but yeah, I mean, there's no easy answer to that one, I'm afraid.
I think that's fair enough, Mark. I think you're right. There is no easy answer. I think just one thing I would add, just for people that aren't familiar in this setting, when Mark talks about bringing them down slowly, he doesn't mean on the alprazolam or the designer benzos they're using, but ideally with the support of a medical team and transferred over to a long-acting of such as diazepam. Is that correct, Mark? Would you support that?
I mean, yeah, I mean, the ideal scenario is to transfer somebody across to a long-acting benzo like diazepam, and then gradually wean from there. Of course, as has been pointed out, when you're not sure what benzo is being taken, because I'm seeing lots of people who are describing, you know, that they're taking alprazolam that they bought online. The most recent story I heard was somebody who said his dealer had been very clever, and when Pfizer were shutting off production of Xanax, he bought up the last of their stock, and that's why he was still able to supply Xanax, branded Xanax, on the illicit market. And I thought, I'm not that gullible. So the problem of working out dose equivalence is really tricky. Even if they're taking the benzo that they think they're taking, and even if you can get an accurate quantity, so that I'm understanding what they think they're taking, you can't even do a straight transfer across to what is the diazepam equivalent, because it's a range, and sometimes the numbers you get are very big and scary, particularly when you're going from, you know, alprazolam or equivalents, where you're sort of calculating that somebody appears to be using 300 milligrams of diazepam equivalent a day.
Yeah, you went up with scary numbers.
Yeah, and to try and do that in the community, a transfer across and then wean, very challenging. Having said that, if your goal is to reduce the risk of seizures, you don't have to give them the dose that they're usually taking. You have to aim for the dose that's the minimum that they can get away with without having too bad withdrawals, which is perhaps a slightly easier and target to hit with a lower dose, but it's still a challenging process, particularly to do as an outpatient, where you're never quite sure what else they might be accessing, and you can never be sure you're the only prescriber or the only source of supply.
That's definitely one of the challenges in Australia, or certainly in Queensland currently, is the multiple prescriber challenge. So yeah. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for chipping in with that. I think I only have one more question left, which is that you put up quite a lot of data about how prolific it is throughout Queensland, even in what look like rural and remote areas on the map. Do you have any data about the other states in Australia, and are they seeing similar?
You go.
Toxicology wise, yes, they are. There is data sharing amongst the different forensic laboratories in the country. I think Queensland seems to be all forensic laboratories analyse things in different ways. I think Queensland, we seem to be seeing more prevalence of these type of drugs, but that might be due to the fact that we're the way that we analyse our samples as well.
Thank you. I've actually got more questions coming, so I'm going to keep going. Apologies to people that have to return to their other services. I'm not sure that I may have misheard this one. I might have been writing a question. It says here, you mentioned venlafaxine was a metabolite of an opioid. Which opioid? I'm wondering if that was lefexidine. Was that mentioned?
No, venlafaxine is an antidepressant on its own.
Yeah.
It's not a metabolite of any opiate.
I don't know where that. Apologies, I don't know where that question came from.
I might have misspoken at the time because I was,
yeah,
trying to convey the case.
But yeah, venlafaxine is definitely not a metabolite of an opioid. Could you provide the name of the website from the UK? Is that one from you, Dan? No. Was there a website in the UK mentioned?
That wasn't the website that Mark mentioned.
Oh, sorry, was that you, Mark? Sorry, I was elsewhere.
Yep. I just replied to the panelists, and it's just gone out as a link on the chat. But it was the site that Heather Ashton used to run, which is benzo.org.uk, which is a great wealth of information collected over several decades.
Yeah, I would definitely back that. If you're interested in information about benzodiazepines, Heather Ashton kind of led the way for many years. Unfortunately passed away only recently this year, but definitely a website there worth checking out. I have one of my colleagues, Dan, who also has a question he'd like to ask the panel. So if you want to step forward, Dan.
All right, thanks for waiting for all this time. Just a quick question about the design of benzos. Just wondering if there's enough unwanted side effects from them. Is that why they're not marketed by the big pharmaceutical companies, and these unwanted side effects would put people off continued use? Because it looked like a lot of the ages of people in those coroner's cases were young, so I was thinking it was more like experimentation.
I think you're right about the experimentation. The drugs, a lot of the drugs we're talking about have been candidates for pharmaceuticals in the past, and it might be that more potent ones are too potent to release to the community, and that's the adverse side effects are the reason that they're doing that. But sometimes there's also the fact that there's other benzodiazepines on the market that actually that are in use, and therefore in Australia there's enough on the market to satisfy the community or therapeutic use of the drug, and therefore they won't, authorise the use or the prescription of these other benzodiazepines. That some of them, the ones we're talking about, are available in other countries as therapeutic drugs, but etizolam is sort of on the par with alprazolam, but therapeutically available in Japan. So yes, you might be right about the effects. I think that's part of the reason that some of these have never actually made it to pharmaceuticals, but there's probably other reasons as well.